And in fact, it's this process of creating these memories. And you mentioned, this is a nail, and you don't know it's a nail, but as you study it, then you start to realize that it's a nail. And really, when I say the tree of consciousness and how your consciousness grows like a tree, I feel like that's how the branches of your tree basically grow out. Yeah. Basically, it's like, as well, the analogy that I typically use for this is, you look at a bird. And the first time you look at a bird, you say it's a bird. And then another thing is a bird. And another thing is a bird. But the more you study it, and I feel like these branches of your consciousness actually grow out during these times of meditative thought, where you're actually really, single-mindedly focusing on something, and you allow yourself to say, there's all these birds, but now I start to distinguish. Certain birds have this feature, and certain birds have this feature. And as I look into it, I say, okay, well, if you have this feature, then it's a female. If it has this feature, then it's a male. And through that, the different separations and branchings of your tree of consciousness happen. Now, as that, one of the Upanishads that I think you speak about, this Ishavasya, I think, in the introduction, you actually talk about this energy that basically grows the human body. I'll take the quote from there because I wrote that down. It says, there is an energy in all human beings which remains inactive in most cases. And the process of sadhana is that by when the potential energy is awakened. Now, I feel that this energy that creates this body is also the energy that also creates your consciousness itself and all the memories within you.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So again, we come back to Purnamada Purnamidam. Yes. That is complete, this is complete. So we believe, we understand that energy that creates the universe, not creates, from which the universe has come about, branched out from, is also the same energy which has developed this little fetus in the womb.
Right. Yes.
But after having done its work, after having created a being who kind of separates himself and is independent.
Yes.
The moment I say independent, which means I am separate. People don't realize that.
Right.
A child is independent because he's separated from his mother.
That's
he
right.
thinks he is independent.
That's right, yeah.
So this energy, which having done its work of making a complete being, of producing or developing or generating a complete being, after it has done its work, it doesn't go away anywhere.
Right.
It still remains in seed form in that individual.
But does it actually become dormant? Because it's created this body, but in fact the everyday workings of digestion and all of that. In fact, every day that you eat, you're actually recreating your body. So
absolutely.
It seems like the energy actually still stays
exists
within
there.
you and
exists there. Also,
it still has to be active.
Also, how much do we really do?
Yes.
You can chew your food.
Yes.
That's it.
Yeah.
After that,
somehow it becomes you.
So there is something inside which is working.
That's right.
That this is energy is potentially there, hidden in every human being, man or woman.
Yes.
Okay. The yogis say that this energy in seed form, we call it the Bindu, which means a dot.
Bindu.
A dot is the smallest. When you put many dots, they become a line, a straight line. And a dot is usually a round thing, usually. When you put a dot, Bindu is round, small, infinitesimally small dot.
Right.
And from that dot, if you put many dots, it becomes a line. Right. Now, if I make a straight line, and if you keep on making a straight line, it's an understood fact in Sankhya philosophy that every straight line is part of a circle. Every straight line, it meets in infinity. You can't say where it meets. But every straight line is part of a curve. It's a large curve. You can't see it. It's a large curve. And so therefore, this entire movement, cycle, starts from that dot. And we are saying that that dot is there in potential form in every living being. So perhaps if you can hit that dot, touch that dot, you can probably get a glimpse, at least as much as your limited brain can allow, of this entire arc. That's what I was trying to say in that, what you quoted.
Right.
And it's interesting because in those days, they didn't, I don't know if Sankhya is an excellent philosophy. It's one of the most ancient philosophies. People talk about Vedanta, people talk about Purva Mimamsa, but very few people talk about Sankhya. And Sankhya is an atheistic philosophy. Okay. There is no creator God in Sankhya. Right. And it was founded by the great teacher Kapila, the Muni Kapila. Okay. Incidentally, Kapila means blonde.
Blonde?
Golden haired.
Okay.
So anyway, so Kapila's ancient system of Sankhya discusses many of the things which we discussed in fact, the very word Sankhya means sum.
Sum, okay.
Calculation. Sum. S-U-M.
Yes, summation.
Summation.
Right.
And Sankhya, even in Sanskrit, when you say 1, 2, 3, it's called Sankhya.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Sankhya is an ancient philosophy which discusses this matter, this subject of the source of all the universe and nature. Right. The source is called Purusha. And the nature which comes out of it is called Prakriti. So the understanding of Sankhya is that all duality and separation is Prakriti. In its original form, Purusha has no duality, no separation, nothing. Okay. When there is a bubble in the Purusha, then Prakriti is out. Okay. So then, how do you go back to Purusha? When Prakriti becomes completely still. In quiet, you're back in the source of Purusha. Right. This is called Kaivalya, according to Sankhya. Not realizing God or anything of that kind. Right. Right. So, I'm now working on a new book, which I'm connecting Sankhya and Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, because the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali by and large are derived from Sankhya, yoga philosophy. So I want to call it Yoga for the Godless. Because you don't need a concept of a creator God. Right. You don't need. If you want, you can have. That's a different story. Sure. But per se, to understand how to attain Kaivalya, you don't need even a concept of a creator God. Right. Sankhya doesn't have. Right. Yoga doesn't have. Now, may I also add that the what in Vedanta is called moksha, in Buddhist teachings called nirvana. In yoga, it's referred to as Kaivalya. Kaivalya. Now, Kaivalya means it's derived from the root word Kevala, which means only one, unity. When the yogi realizes after his mind becomes quiet, free of distractions, free of conflicts, that actually there is only one, and what appears as separate units does not exist. Right. Right. So therefore he is supposed to have attained Kaivalya. Now in Kaivalya there is no question of freeing yourself from anything, because there is nothing to free yourself from. You are free.
You just forgot it because of your illusion of separation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah, and to this, we'll go back to the separation a little bit. And when we say the separation and then we say this I, like really when you really try to define what this I is, you really start to see just the trouble that you get into as you start to think about this I. You know, when you say I, is it this body?
Which I?
Well, like when you say I as in, and you know, when an individual says there is this me, there is this I, when I really start to probe them on what is this really I, then you know all these circular arguments start to happen. Like for instance, when you say I, you can say, and I say, what is this I that you talk about? You say, okay, well it's this body. And I say to them, well, if it's just this body, in fact, you are actually constantly sharing energy with this body. You know, as you breathe, particles are moving out, and as you breathe in, particles move in. As you eat, particles move in, and somehow, you know, if you talk about the atoms themselves, all of these atoms will refresh over the course of a month. If you talk about even the cells themselves, all of them will also refresh. So now you can say that, you know, if you say that you're the body, then this body is actually exchanging energy with...
Which body?
Yes, which body, yes. And then they say, okay, no. The I isn't just the body, that's this mind. And I say to them, if it's this mind, then really what you're saying is it's this energy pattern and the collection of the data that's in your mind. But in fact, when you think about the collection of this data in your mind, the data that's in your mind now is also very different from the data that was in your mind a week ago, a month ago. So in fact, it seems like when you say this I, it seems to be just a process of changing
Yeah,
Yeah.
I believe that. No,
Yeah.
this is also Sankhya. Actually,
Yes.
what you're talking is Sankhya. They say it's a constant process of change
Yes.
taking place,
Yes.
and the only changeless thing is change. Everything else changes.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
that's the only thing that is
Yes.
changing. So therefore, it cannot be you.
Yes. Yes. Because if it's changing, then how can you?
How-
What is this you?
What is the you?
Yes. Yes. You are not even the same you that was 1 week ago. One
No,
month
why
ago.
1 week?
Yes.
10
Even
minutes
one,
ago?
Yes.
So seeing this, that this is not found,
Yes.
then one goes and figures out that perhaps it is not all this that is the reality.
Yes.
It's something more than this.
Right.
It's not any of these changing patterns.
Right.
That is why Guru Maharshi said, finally when you touch the true I, which is not the eye of
Yes. Not the eye of this brain that we
animal
talk
or
about.
fan,
Yes.
here, then all this, there is no duality left.
Yes. Yeah.
And through duality you cannot find it.
Yes.
When you realize that none of this duality can be that,
Yes.
then perhaps at some point, perhaps, nobody can say yes or no,
Right.
perhaps something happens.
Yes.
And then and I think that happening cannot be a logical 1 + 1 kind of thinking.
Yes, because even 1 + 1, already this 1 + 1 embedded in there is this idea of separation.
Exactly.
So because of that, you cannot use basically all the fundamental laws of science and math to describe it, because inherent in the assumption of all the science and math is this idea of separation.
So I cannot even say I am inquiring.
Right.
Because there is that I which is I am trying to inquire is actually very deceptive.
Yes.
You cannot place it.
Yes.
I cannot even say that. So therefore, when all inquiry comes to an end,
Yes.
when I say, no, this is not working,
Right.
wherever
Right.
I inquire, it's still a separation. There are two things trying to figure out. There is no unity. Finally, I think when you're fed up and when you give up,
Yes.
I call that surrender, not surrendering to somebody.
Right. Yes. Surrendering
say-
actually to the
Yeah.
universe itself,
Yeah.
almost. Yes.
Then you see this whole universe is inside you.
That's right.
And you are inside the universe both ways.
Yes.
And is moving.
Yes.
Constantly on the move.
Yes. And in fact, when you talk about this universe being inside you, in fact, all of us, the reality that we live in, we think that, reality is out there. But in fact, the reality that you're living in is all inside this brain, really,
So
right?
this is again, we are coming to the same point
Yes.
that it's all made here.
Yes.
And when once that making completely stops, perhaps, we don't know how, but if it stops, then perhaps you'll see who's making it.
Right.
Perhaps.
Yes, yes, yes. Okay. And, I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into this idea of consciousness itself, and not the overriding consciousness of the universe, but the consciousness of the brain. When we think about the idea of the consciousness of your brain, and let's take a step back and look at it from neuroscience perspective. Really your consciousness arises through just interactions of neurons. So there are these neurons, and in fact, as these neurons fire together, some of these neurons will actually bond closer together, because as they fire together,
Nobody knows why they fire at each
yes,
other.
but somehow they fire at each other. Now each individual neuron itself doesn't know your brain consciousness, right?
Yeah.
But somehow out of the interaction of all these neurons, somehow your consciousness just emerges out of
So
nowhere.
therefore, this consciousness which you're talking about is not a reality.
Yes.
It's merely
It's
a
just a-
product of the firings of certain
That's right.
neurons put into a design, right?
Yes.
This is what you're trying.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
Okay.
And in fact, when we think about, and here I'll go back to self-similarity a bit. Really
Go
what
back
we can
to?
go back to self-similarity.
Okay.
Now, when we look at the neurons themselves, it's that they're making closer connection to other neurons, and other neurons are not as close because they have not fired together. Now, if you look at humans themselves, and out of these neurons, out of these closer connections from this neuron to this neuron, and more distant connection from this neuron to neuron, out of the combination of all of these different interconnected play of neurons, your consciousness just seems to emerge. Now let's look at humans. In fact, humans have a very similar mechanism in the way we create relationships as well. The more someone the more you interact with one person, the easier it actually becomes to interact with that person.
Right.
The more time you spend with your family, the easier it becomes to interact with the family. So now if we understand, really, our consciousness is actually a hive mind of all these neurons. So who's to say that there isn't actually a consciousness that arises from all the different interactions of the people themselves? In fact, when you look at, for instance, a beehive, in fact, there you actually truly see how this hive mind process actually works. Each individual bee has a mind of its own. Yet, it's through the interactions of all these bees that somehow a higher consciousness seems to form. Now, in the same way, our neurons seem to form a higher consciousness, but I feel that through the interactions of people themselves, higher order levels of consciousness can actually emerge. So when you look at, for instance, and people have done studies on this, you look at a corporation. A corporation is the mixture of a bunch of people that work for the corporation. But when you actually look at the behaviors of this corporation, they actually take on very human-like qualities themselves. And in fact, beyond corporations, cities, countries, and you see that even a country itself starts to act like an organism on all its own. And you can actually really see this when countries go to war. When a country goes to war, there are people, individual components of this country that will sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the whole. And in fact, in today's world, you don't find the countries acting so much like people, but if we even peel back to a couple hundred years ago, we now see that these countries, in fact, also want to expand, right? In fact, they take on these the interactions of all the humans within themselves actually start to take on the human characteristics themselves. Countries want to expand. They want to take over another. And they want to become more and more and more. So in fact, when you think about this consciousness that arises through interactions, and I look at the concept of the Brahman itself within the Upanishads, it almost seemed, for me, the idea of Brahman is through the interactions of the whole universe itself, and all the interconnected plays and all the complexity that arises out of it, an intelligence could actually be overriding all of it in the same way that an intelligence overrides the interactions with the neurons themselves. And I was wondering, do the Upanishads talk anything about that, or?
First of all, as I said, the very word Brahman comes from expansion, right? And the Upanishads, it need not be Upanishad. It is there in the Upanishad, of course, but it's a fact that, as you said, there is an overriding principle, which, for instance, some neurons fire at each other, some don't. So there is something going on there which chooses which to fire and which not to fire, right? Somewhere. So there is an overriding something. Now that overriding something is the essence, the reality. But you cannot discover it as long as you are part of the process. Because when you are part of the process, you already become two. You separate it, right? One neuron against the other, or one neuron for other. Either way. So the Upanishads say that if you can go beyond these dualities, of course, in the beginning it will still be the neuron firing to even understand this. But then somewhere there is a process by which it can be reversed. Now that reversing process has a word in Vedanta. It's called the Nivritti Marga. Nivritti Marga. As opposed to Pravritti Marga, which is going outside. If it can just turn itself around, instead of looking for a solution out, if it can look for a solution inside, and then step by step, gradually, layer by layer, when all action ceases and there is one kind of a quietness, then you see the ground from which all these actions start. That ground is called the Brahman. And it is reflected in day-to-day life and this creation of the world and everything as a constant feeling of expansion. Why expansion? Because one is never satisfied with being what one is.
We're actually a contradiction in ourselves. Everyone wants stability, but they also want expansion.
So both don't work.
So you can't be stable and be expanded. Yes, and you can't expand and be stable.
Giving up actually means not physically giving up, but to understand this process. When monks say, I have renounced everything, they have renounced their clothes and their houses and their wealth. They have not renounced their desire to expand.
Right, yes.